Todas y a todos, bienvenidos al segundo encuentro del ciclo Diálogos Impertinentes, Tecnoimágenes y políticas de las pandemias. Hoy tenemos con nosotros a Eric Oliveira y a Richard Grusin, a quienes presentaré de inmediato. Esta es el segundo encuentro de un ciclo de 6 presentaciones que ha sido organizado por la Red Imagenlat, la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y el Instituto de Investigaciones de Cultura y Arte de la Universidad de Salta, que además cuenta con el apoyo el centro, the Center for 21st Century Studies, el programa de posgraduación en enseñanza y relaciones étnico-raciales de la Universidad Federal del Sur de Bahía y el programa de posgraduación en comunicación de la Universidad Estatal de Río de Janeiro. Hoy, como mencionaba, tenemos a Eric Oliveira y a Richard Grusin hablando de la relación Trump-Bolsonaro en el nuevo contexto de pandemia. Y bueno, además a esto se le agrega toda la situación que está ocurriendo desde hace una semana en los Estados Unidos. Por temas de comunicación, esta sesión será en inglés. Tanto la ponencia de Eric como la de Richard, como la discusión será desarrollada en inglés. Así que ahora voy a cambiar de idioma para presentar a los ponentes. Okay, so first we will have Richard Grusin. He's a distinguished professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies. Grusin's academic work is fundamentally interdisciplinary. His main interests include various aspects of media, environmental, cultural, and American studies. Among his books are Culture, Technology, and Creation of America's National Parks, Remediation, Understanding New Media, which he co-authored with J. David Bolter, which is a book regarded as a founding text of the field of new media studies. And also his book, Remediation, Affect and Mediality After 9/11. He will be the first one giving a talk. And then we will have Eric Felinto, who has a PhD in comparative literature from the Universidad del Estado de Río de Janeiro and from UCLA. He has developed postdoctoral research projects in media studies at the Universität der Kunst Berlin and has been a visiting scholar in the Media and Culture program at the University of New York. He is a full professor at the Universidad del Estado de Río de Janeiro, where he developed research projects on media, cinema, and cyberculture. He also leads the research group Culturas Tecnológicas, Medialidades, Materialidades, Temporalidades. He's the author of the book Avatar, O Futuro do Cinema, Ecologia das Imagens Digitais, and O Explorador de Abismos, Willenflusser e o Posthumanismo. So, please, I would like to thank, first of all, Richard and Eric for being here. And now we're giving first, okay, so I'm going to explain very quickly what the format will be. We'll have first a talk by Richard, around 20 minutes, then a talk by Eric, 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for the discussion with questions that I can also offer Richard and Eric between them, but also the audience can make questions through the YouTube chat, and then we will give these questions to the speakers, and we can also discuss that. So we will begin now with Richard.
Thank you, Claudio. Happy to be doing this. Thanks to Robert Rubio and the Imagenlat crew, and I'm really happy to be here with my good friend and bromance buddy, Eric Felinta. I wish I was in Rio with Eric, but this is about as close as we can get in the quarantine. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to show you some photos afterwards and talk through them. Here goes. So, for many activists, the COVID-19 pandemic presented new glimmers of hope for the destruction of capitalism and its replacement with a social and economic system that is just and egalitarian for humans and non-humans alike. For such radical thinkers, the current pandemic lays bare the unsustainability and inequities of the current political system. Rather than strive to return to the normal state of affairs prior to the pandemic, people have asked, why not take advantage of this destruction to bring forth a new, more just political economy and social welfare state? Let's not just go back to business as it was before, business as usual, but as we've seen with the suspension of public space, the issuing of quarantines and so forth, it is possible to make really large social changes quickly if we want. So in a blog post that I published last month, I tried to make sense of our pandemic maskings, the wearing of masks, in relation to the question of popular resistance, rebellion. If our masks could be seen or could be made to function as tokens of collective resistance, not only to the virus, but to the devastating forces of racialized capitalism that have both enabled and been exacerbated by the current coronavirus pandemic. Recent events in the United States, brought to a head by the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police, have made revolution, or at the very least, massive popular resistance, a real possibility. So I'll first read some passages from this recent blog post, then turn to look at several images from recent protests in Chicago, my hometown. My focus in doing so is to think about the ways that masks have and could continue to function as creating what Jonathan Flatley has called revolutionary counter-moods, whose purpose is to intensify revolutionary sentiment among those who would resist the violence of structural racism and the injustices and inequalities fostered by capitalism. In the blog piece, sorry, am I still good? All right. In the blog piece, I argued that masks are not secondary epiphenomena of pre-existing collectivities, but rather radical mediations that help to generate revolutionary collectivities that operate in a qualitatively different fashion from the additive collection of atomistic individuals. Revolutionary mediations of this kind help to create and hold together habits of collective assembly that themselves generate individual instances of resistance. The multiplication of masks can work to make evident the multiplication of force in a revolutionary collective. We've seen masks function this way in films and television where they serve a double purpose. On the one hand, wearing a mask is part of a revolutionary collective, like the Guy Fawkes masks in V for Vendetta or the Joker masks in Joker, works to conceal the individual identity of the wearer. But these masks also generate a revolutionary collectivity, multiplying through repetition the intensity of revolutionary or resistant community. These masks are not primarily symbolic, but function as an index of intensity or multiplicity or power, more than as a representation of a particular revolutionary concept or demand. So in that piece, I'm trying to look at the way in which masks themselves have agency or could be made to have revolutionary agency. Masks in films like these, and also in the recent HBO adaptation of Watchmen, work to bring revolutionary collectivities and counter moods into being through a redistribution of the sensible, in the terms of Rancière. What they demonstrate, I would argue, is how symbolic masks can work metonymically as well as metaphorically. But how does collectivity work in the case of COVID masks, which have been widely adopted as a way to diminish the spread of the virus? On the one hand, these masks separate us from one another, keeping us apart rather than bringing us together in large numbers. But wearing these masks can also be seen to enable a kind of socially distanced collectivity as we head out to the market or travel on the streets, sidewalks, buses, or trains in our cities. COVID masks create new forms of solidarity and collectivity, modeling a kind of collective care for one another aimed less at the health of any one particular individual than at the health of the community. This masked collective care stands in stark contrast to the pointed refusal of President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence to wear masks in their public appearances, even when they're asked to do so by their hosts. This refusal to wear masks is consistent with Trump's and Pence's rejection of the guidance of scientific and medical experts, a rejection which predates the COVID pandemic. In fact, in states that voted for Trump in 2016, states in the South or my neighboring state, Indiana, wearing a mask is a political statement, marking the wearer as a liberal. In addition to standing in opposition to Trump and Pence, wearing masks models caring for others, caring for the collective itself, something that is not really a feature of Trump and his supporters. But the question I asked myself in mid-April was whether these masks of collective care could be transformed into masks of protest, rebellion, resistance, or revolution. Many of us have been feeling intense rage at the injustices laid bare and exacerbated by this pandemic. It's long past time, I wrote, for us to collectivize this rage and figure out how to make some real change, which must begin, I argued, by destroying things that are valuable to those who perpetuate and benefit from this structural injustice. One of the best examples of how to generate this kind of revolutionary mediation can be found among the masked feminists of Chile, who've been a prominent force in the ongoing Chilean protest against social inequality that began in October 2019. In March 2020, masked feminists protested publicly in large numbers across Latin America Women's Day marches. And most powerfully on March 9th, the day after these massive Latin American marches, Chile's masked feminists inspired a general strike in their country to protest ongoing injustices across the nation. Their use of masks to create a revolutionary collective, despite the Chilean government's prohibition of wearing them in public, could serve, I argued, as an inspiration for how we in the US might remediate our COVID masks. I concluded that blog post by suggesting that insofar as masking for care is becoming habitual, this might be the perfect time in the US and across the world, perhaps through looting or rioting in flash mobs or smaller collectivities, to begin working not only for the care of one another, but towards the destruction and dispossession of those who impede such care, whether for the benefit of the poor, immigrants, the environment, or peoples of all colors, genders, and ethnicities. Although our COVID masks had not brought us there yet, I argued, they contained within them the radical potentiality to mobilize collectivities of resistance, or perhaps even revolution, through the redistribution of capital and political power. Well, now, nearly just short of 2 months later, we've seen over the past 9 days how the murder of George Floyd has galvanized in the US the beginnings of such a revolutionary countermood, as multiracial, multi-generational collectivities have taken to the streets of cities in the US to demonstrate their outrage at the continued racialized violence of the police and of the state generally. This outrage has been primed as well by the racialized economic injustice that we've witnessed during the COVID pandemic, where rates of infection and death have been disproportionately higher among people of color, prisoners, and elderly residents of long-term care facilities. In looking through techno-images distributed across our screens over the past 10 days by participants and news photographers, I've been struck repeatedly by the ways in which masks have operated in the current unrest, both to demarcate public space and to distinguish protesters from the police. Masks play well in visual mediation in the photographs we see on our screens, helping to delineate for viewers the opposing forces, the way in which uniforms delineate teams on a football field or a baseball field. So in my remaining time here, I want to look at a few news photographs from the current unrest in Chicago, my hometown, to see both how masks have been fostering revolutionary collectivity and to suggest how they might be used to intensify that collectivity going forward against police violence and structural racism in the US. And what we'll see from these is not only how masks have been used in the news and in these recent protests, but I'll also provide some images of masking in film or TV to look at how they have premediated this current sort of revolutionary masking. So if we could have the first image, I can talk you through these. So this first image is a photograph of Black Lives Matter protesters, and as you'll see, every one of them is masked. They're masked for COVID, but the masks together, I think, provide a sense, along with, of course, protest signs and so forth, of a kind of collectivity, that they're all part of the same revolutionary or rebellious group, collective, and so on. This photo was taken on the north side of Chicago, which is less racially diverse than the south side and the west side. That is to say, there are fewer Black residents, and you can see in this picture that it is a fairly diverse group, but also, I think, in this first photo, dominated by white faces, and even a guy in a Chicago Cubs t-shirt in the center. And the Cubs are traditionally the north side team in Chicago. So if we could go to the second image, we can see something a little different. Here again, South 41 is a highway. This is an entrance to a highway in Chicago, and this has been occupied by protesters, again, all masked up, and also many of them in black. And what I've been trying to argue and think through both in that blog piece, but in other places as well, is the way in which revolution or resistance is motivated as much by certain kinds of objects as it is by, let's say, ideologies. That is, these objects work in a kind of Latourian sense as a kind of glue to hold people together and as a way to inspire people to feel as if they belong to something larger. We've seen examples of this in Hong Kong, in the Umbrella Revolution, in the Green Vests in France, and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and so forth. The sardines in Italy. These haven't been masked, but they've all been objects that have worked to generate a kind of collectivity through what I describe as the radical mediation of non-human artifacts and agents. So now to look at the third photo, another sense of mask. Here you've got people, especially in the center, you've got a mask used to conceal the identity of a looter. And these are people who have come, looters is the way they're described by, let's say, the state. We could also describe them as redistributors of capital who have been, in a small way and with a force counter to the force that's been used by police and the state, have been redistributing commodities by breaking into buildings and liberating property that was denied them in the past. So this is another example of how masks have been used in these kinds of moments of resistance or revolution. So let's look at the next photo. The next photo is a really interesting one. Actually, the next two are the same, are versions of the same incident, and you'll see the aftermath in a second. This is a man in Chicago who was caught on camera wearing a Joker mask, about to blow up this police car, about to set it on fire. So he's about to light some rag or something in the gas tank that will blow this up. And this, as we'll see in a later picture, this really harkens back to, so you could say this image remediates the Joker, but I'd prefer to say that Joker premediates this kind of activity with the use of masks as a kind of, as marking the forms or the group of resistance. So here he is caught in the act, and here he is afterwards sitting down, maybe posting on his phone, and you can see the fire on the left-hand side in the background of that cop car. So this is these are really interesting photos to me. Unfortunately for this guy, he's been apprehended by the police and is in jail right now. Here's the photo from the Joker that I was referring to. This is near the end of the film when there's these mass riots against police for having killed, for these young Wall Street guys having beat up Joker and others, but also generated by the kind of economic inequality that the Joker film portrays. And so it's like our present moment, although Joker takes place in a comic world and takes place in a time period that is something around 1970s in the US, although it's a fictionalized world as comic worlds are. The issues at play in Joker are issues that are very much of our moment. And those issues involve police violence, and they also involve economic inequality. So it's a really interesting, I think, contrast here to look at. So let's take a look at the next photo, and see how, in the next couple, we'll see how the police themselves now use masks in a kind of uniform way to mark them. Okay, this photograph, it's a really interesting photo, and there are a number of others that you can find online as well, is a group of Chicago police pushing back against the protesters outside Trump International Hotel in downtown Chicago. One of the obscenities of downtown Chicago is that Trump put up a building, a hotel right on the river, and the big name Trump is there for all to see in big letters. There's a whole genre of photographs, I have several myself, of people putting up the middle finger, flipping the bird at the Trump sign and the Trump Hotel. So this was a natural place for protesters to congregate in the recent days in this protest against the violence against George Floyd and against the racialized violence that Trump has been encouraging since he was campaigning for president and has been really accelerating as president. So what you see is that the cops too have masks. They have helmets and masks and their uniform. And this image, the visual divide of this image is a very clear-cut kind of representation of the difference between the protesters, again, most of whom, but not all of whom are masked in this case, and the uniformly masked police. Collectivity is created by masking on either side. And one of the things that brings the police together and that marks them as part of this unit is the way in which they all wear the same mask, especially with the visors in front, concealing their individuality as they participate in this collective violence. And what they're doing here is what happens at almost every protest. Protests in public space are about the battle to control space. So the police here are pushing back the protesters. You can almost see that as you look at the shape of those blue helmets. It's a force or a wedge that is pushing back. There are some really good photographs of some of the protesters face to face with a cop, just standing there, staring them down. And one of the goals in protest, one of the things that protesters try to do when the police do this, is to form a line to kind of block them off, not to make it easy for them to move through. And you can see the two forces here, one moving forward from the right, the other resisting on the left. But the masks are, I think, pretty powerful, the helmet masks. Let's look at the next picture where we can see, this is from HBO's Watchmen, and it's a similar example of how the kind of masks and the uniforms that are worn creates a kind of collectivity, a sense of multitude, mass, force, this line of unchanging faces. And again, Watchmen here is both remediating situation in the US, but also you can see Watchmen here as premediating something like this. There also is an image that I don't have here from Washington, D.C., where Trump called out the military the other night to stand in a line like this with helmets on the steps of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, which is a memorial that is about and proclaims a kind of collective tolerance and unity. So that's just, I think, another example of the interrelation of cinematic and news images. So let's look at the next image. And here is an image of police individuality. And this is, I think, a disgusting image in my eyes, which is a Chicago police. You can see the star at the top that says, see the beginning of Chicago, with his helmet and his visor, wearing this hideous mask of a big white face, chomping on a little cigar. That cigar he's chomping on refers back, I think, for many of us, to Clint Eastwood in Sergio Leone's Man with No Name trilogy, where Eastwood was often chomping that little, that stub of a Bruto cigar. And here you see the Chicago policeman just concealing his identity or adopting an even more brutal identity when singled out. Let's look at the next photo, which is my last photo. So this was also taken outside Trump Tower. And I don't believe it's a young girl, but it certainly looks like a young girl, also in a clown mask, sitting down and just resting in front of the cops as they march by, protecting Trump's own hotel from the protests against his politics. So I guess I will just leave it at that, and I'll be happy afterwards to answer questions that any of you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard, for such an interesting talk. Now we're gonna give them time for Eric to give his presentation, and then we'll discuss.
Hi, Claudio. Hi, Richard. Hi, Roberto. Unlike Richard, I don't have a paper, and I don't think I'm going to talk for like 20 minutes. So I just have some notes, and I thought it would be interesting for the public to have some perspective on what's going on in Brazil right now. We're facing this pandemic situation in a very peculiar way because of the government, the current Brazilian government, which in a way is it's kind of a copy of what's going on in the US, not in terms of the real politics, but in terms of the image that this government's trying to construct. But I think I should begin with the most obvious point, which is the idea that the pandemic's not a historic event that could be reduced to its scientific determination. There's a phrase that has been going around here lately. A lot of people have been saying that the virus strikes everyone equally with no ideological or political distinctions. And of course, this is true only from a purely scientific and objective point of view. But the problem is that we don't live in a purely scientific reality. Lots of scholars have been writing about the economic, political, or philosophical implications of the pandemic. I even think that Bruno Latour would say that the outbreak is at once real, a social, and also a narrative reality. And of course, there's lots of different possible narratives about the virus and the pandemic, according to the many different political and ideological perspectives. But I'm particularly interested in the ways this event has been appropriated by the far-right discourses here in Brazil. As with many other issues, the responses of the current government to the pandemic have been mostly limited to look to the US in order to imitate Trump's actions. Even in his obsession with chloroquine, the medicine that Trump recommended for use with the COVID patients, Bolsonaro has just been echoing what's going on in the US. And this is very interesting because although he presents himself as a nationalist, Bolsonaro is always looking for U.S. approval. Trump is admittedly his hero, and the U.S. represents the ideal model of social structure for Brazil, in a complete disregard for our particular history and reality. This is not surprising, considering that the Brazilian middle class has always perceived the US as a kind of paradisiacal fictional land where there's no poverty, everybody's white, and life is simple and clean. And in fact, I think for many people who are Bolsonaro supporters, the whole US could be reduced to a gigantic type of Disneyland, which is, by the way, one of the favorite destinations for the vacations of the middle class in Brazil. And on the other hand, Bolsonaro's stance on the pandemic has been pretty much dictated by the so-called guru of the new Brazilian far-right, the self-entitled philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, who now coincidentally lives in rural Virginia in the US. And I would like to talk a little bit about Olavo de Carvalho, because I think he is a very important actor in the current political scene in order for us to understand what's going on in Brazil in political terms. And of course, we can talk about this wave of far-right ideology in the whole world. And we can also talk about the peculiarities and the singularities of the Brazilian situation. But there's also lots of connections between what's going on here in political terms and the global scenarios, and also specifically in the US. I have been reading this really interesting book, War for Eternity, about Steve Bannon. And as you people probably know, Steve Bannon was a very important actor in Trump's campaign. He worked for Trump's campaign. And apparently he also gave some important advices for Bolsonaro's campaign. And what most people don't know is that Olavo de Carvalho and Bolsonaro, they have very intimate relationship. They have very strong connections to Steve Bannon. And there's actually a whole chapter on the book that talks about the dinner at Bannon's house in Washington, where Bannon is introduced to some of the most important political characters in Brazilian politics nowadays. I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs of that text so you can have an idea of this very, peculiar relationship between Steve Bannon and Bolsonaro. The main attraction entered the living room. The guests in whose honor Steve had arranged the dinner. Everyone made space and broke out in cheers as he and Steve walked across the room to greet each other. One of the younger Brazilians standing next to me was fighting back tears. With smiles and laughs, we made our way to the long, impressively leaden table. We sat down and said grace, reciting the Lord's Prayer with our heads bowed, as is the routine for the Brazilian guests. The mood wouldn't become jovial again until after a few minutes, a middle-aged Brazilian investment banker named Gerald Brandt tapped his glass and proposed a toast. "This is a dream come true," he said. "Trump is in the White House, Bolsonaro is in Brasilia. And here we are in Washington, Bannon and Olavo de Carvalho face to face. This is a new world, my friends." But for me, what's really interesting about these connections is the fact that politics nowadays is no longer determined by rational decisions. There's a lot of people studying the influence of, emotions and affects in politics. And I think what happened in Brazil, the last election, was the fact that Bolsonaro invested heavily in propaganda and was able to completely destroy the image of the previous government. And at the same time, he created a sort of messianic figure, which would be capable of saving Brazil from all kinds of disgraces that have been plaguing the country from many years. Regarding the pandemic, Bolsonaro's behavior has been also determined by Olavo de Carvalho's discourse. I would like to also show an image. It's actually the second image, the one where Olavo de Carvalho appears. If you can see this image, this is an ad for a talk that Olavo de Carvalho posted on YouTube. It's an interview with two right-wing bloggers. And in this interview, Olavo de Carvalho talks about the pandemic. And the title in Portuguese reads, "China and the World Health Organization have hidden from you chloroquine." Actually, Olavo de Carvalho and Bolsonaro don't believe that the pandemic, the outbreak, is real. Bolsonaro has said once that the COVID is just like flu. And there's a lot of people in Brazil right now who don't believe in what's going on. They actually don't believe what they see in the media. There's people going to the hospitals trying to prove that there's no patients there. There's people who are trying to prove that the whole pandemic situation is a conspiracy created by leftists in order to destroy Brazil's economy. So the current situation in Brazil right now, the political situation is very, very strange, because there's this huge gap between the scientific discourse, the media discourse, the discourse in academia, in the university, and what's going on amongst the supporters of Bolsonaro. And for me, one of the most interesting components of this current situation is the belief in this global conspiracy, which is very important for Bolsonaro. It was very important in Bolsonaro's campaign, especially when he was attacking the Workers' Party, which was the only real leftist government in Brazil, or at least presented itself as the only real leftist government in Brazil. So I would conclude by just saying that we are facing a very difficult situation, because it's impossible to correct what's going on in terms of politics if we pay attention only to the rational aspects the rational aspects of the political situation. We have to understand what's going on in terms of symbols, in terms of the imagination that surrounds the political agents right now. One of the interesting aspects of the current political situation in Brazil, which is very, very tense, Brazil is very divided right now, is the fact that we have been using lots of symbols, especially through social media, but also in our daily lives, to represent these two factions, which are apparently situated in the extremes of the political spectrum. On the one hand, there's people who are being identified as leftists or communists, and on the other hand, there's the right-wingers who propose that the only salvation for Brazil is massive investments in the economy, and the fact that we should not listen to the traditional institutions, the international institutions like the World Health Association or even international media. Almost every day now in Brazil, people have been protesting against Bolsonaro on the streets, and people have been following what's going on internationally. The Black Lives Movement, for instance, and some people tried to do something similar here last week. But on the other hand, what really surprises me is the resilience of Bolsonaro government. We had lots of scandals. A very popular minister, actually 2 ministers, have resigned. 3 ministers have resigned from government in the last few weeks. 2 health ministers and the justice ministers have resigned because of Bolsonaro's position regarding the pandemic, and also because, according to the justice minister, Bolsonaro was trying to control the federal police. And even so, Bolsonaro's popularity is still relatively high here in Brazil. So I believe this is due to the fact that the left has been trying to deal with the issue in a rational manner, trying to find rational alternatives to deal with this problem. But I don't think we're paying enough attention to the emotional components, to the whole imaginary that has been built in the last few months in order to support the right-wing ideologies. And I think it's time for us to pay attention to the myths, the symbols, the memes, everything that's going on right now in social media. And maybe we're now beginning to pay attention to that. People are replying on Facebook, and people have been using symbols like the anti-fascist symbol on Facebook in order to ascertain certain political positions. So I think that's a good beginning for our conversation. I'll talk a little bit about this imaginary component of the political situation right now in Brazil, and how we can be able to create new alternatives in order to fight a discourse that is not really concerned with human lives, but is only preoccupied with the economic situation in Brazil. I would like to just show the second image, which is actually the first that I gave Roberto. The first picture shows Bolsonaro when he was interviewed by a Brazilian media outlet, and he was asked about the pandemic situation. Right now, Brazil is among the first 5 countries in the whole world where the levels of deaths by the pandemic are very, very high, extremely high. And a reporter just asked Bolsonaro what he would do about the pandemic and what could be done about the deaths. And he just replied with this the sentence in Portuguese, saying "E daí," which in English would be translated as So what? Yeah. So what? So what? Which is a very, very strange response from chief of state. So yeah, I think that's it. I apologize for not having anything really lined up, organized. But I think the intention was just to discuss some ideas and talk a little bit about the situations in the different countries. And I think with the questions, I can expand on the idea of how the far right in Brazil was able to advance its cause in the last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your presentation, for your talk. Now we can see also that Richard is wearing also a mask. We have already a few questions, but before going to the questions, which I'll read out loud for you, so also the people in the audience can hear about them. But also, I just wanted to comment briefly on what you were both saying, and also start opening up with some questions before we move on to the questions from the audience. First, regarding Richard's presentation, I found it very, very interesting, very thought-provoking, and one of the things also that struck me from this new situation, which is to some degree is very new and everything has changed in a way very quickly. But on the other hand, it's what we are seeing is also just an intensification of tendencies that we were seeing from before. So I think it's a strange combination of something that's changing very quickly, but also things are becoming sort of tendencies that were already in play in capitalist, that were proper of capitalist crisis and the precarity of capitalism. We've seen how have become intensified. So I find very interesting what you started with, this idea of collective action and collective care, and how this has shown us that it is possible to actually produce real change very quickly, which is always the problem of social resistance. We're always drawn into this idea of, capitalism is this sort of eternal force, eternal drive, and there's nothing we can do. The same, and so there's a strong link with this idea of global warming and ecological catastrophe, because it's like, oh, why should I bother recycling? What is one bottle of plastic? It's at the end is a very similar logic to the idea of the pandemic. Is I don't stay at home only because of my own selfish interest. I stay at home also because it's a sort of collective care. And I think this change of mentality can prove, hopefully, very productive. I hope. And second point is this about the relationship that you established that is quite interesting between mask, COVID, protest, anonymity. I think that's also quite interesting, because there's this idea of nowadays with this also even before COVID and before the protests, in the context of there's this tendency towards anonymity as a political position, thinking, for example, in technologies as algorithmic face recognition, for example. There are artists who are thinking of masks and makeup schemes and even hairstyles to avoid recognition. So there was a time, I think, I've been I've done some research on this area following Foucault's idea of individuation, and when he defines disciplinary societies, so modern political projects, there's this sort of democratization of the processes of individuality. So before modernity, only powerful people were individualized. The rest was just like some sort of nameless mass. And, so through visual mediations such as portrait painting, for example, you would individualize, but you would individualize only the powerful. And Foucault is saying, well, with modernity and with disciplinary institutions, everybody becomes an individual. Everybody becomes a subject of individuation technologies. So anonymity becomes exactly a form of resistance to that project of surveillance, which I think is interesting as a political to consider anonymity or the political dimension of anonymity. I think that's interesting. And I would just like to open with some questions, both for Eric and Richard, before reading some of the questions from the audience. So I have one question for both of you. I would like if you could talk a bit about the role of social media in all what's happening, both in COVID and in the protests in the US, because there's been a lot of controversy with Twitter, with Facebook, and all of that. So I would like if Richard could talk a bit about that, and also Eric in relation to Bolsonaro and how it relates to this new idea of politics. And then a second question, which is more directed to Eric specifically, which is this idea of, he mentioned that now politics is entering this new age of where emotions and affects are like sort of the main thing, leaving behind this idea, this rational project, politics as a sphere where we discuss political, rational ideas. But my question there is, was politics ever that, or is this just the ideal that we had, that politics were in modernity, but in reality was always it's always been a game of affects and emotions. And in relation to that, should we aspire to go back to that sort of modern rational politics, or should we try to sort of go beyond the current state of affects and emotions? So those two things, and then after that, I'll read for you the questions from the audience.
Who do you want to go first? Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Eric, you good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Of course, I want to answer your question, the question for you too. So Claudio, first I want to just comment on the couple of points you made before the question. On the way in which the COVID care could relate to something like climate change, just a couple things I would say. And one is that, sure, we can do things individually, but what we've seen in the quarantines is that actually the state can do dramatic things if it wants to. And what's really going to slow climate change down is not you and I recycling all of our bottles, or even all of our friends recycling their bottles, but it's going to be laws and agreements.
Yeah, sure, we can do
on corporations and things like that. And so that's sort of one thing I would say about that. In terms of Foucault and the individuation issue, I think that's also a super interesting point about anonymity. One of the things with facial recognition technology that's really problematic is that it's not very good on Black faces. That is, facial recognition technology makes more mistakes trying to identify Black faces than white faces. And so that's a real problem there. But I think that the masks can serve to make it even harder for that technology to work. And in Hong Kong, when they masked up in one of the more recent protests, it was because of the facial recognition technology that had been put up on light standards and things like that in the streets of Hong Kong. And I think today, like what you said before, is that individuation at one point was a form of democratization, because in a kind of pre-modernity, only the powerful were individualized. But today, it's only the rich and powerful who can become anonymous. That is, they're the ones who can afford a kind of anonymity if they want to afford the technology. Anyway, just 2 comments on that. On the question of social media in protest and COVID, and that really speaks also from my perspective to the question of affect or emotion. I think social media operate, well, a couple things. One, as far back as the Egyptian spring, we've had all of these this idea that, that was the Twitter revolution and so forth. And it was never just social media. I mean, what social media can do is to spread affect, can intensify people's feelings. It can be used to organize and to tell people where to go, Twitter and things like that. Here's where the demonstration will be. But finally, I think social media is ineffective in producing real political change, but it is a great instrument for people like, the Trump campaign in 2016, which used, via bots and other things, social media to dominate the media space and to win the election. And then I would just say on the question of politics and social media is that social media always operates effectively. I mean, there is some reason there, but it's really designed to intensify affect. And I think you're right that politics has always been emotional, and that the idea that that people make decisions based upon a rational evaluation of policies and how they impact on their lives, that's the myth of economics, for example, and individual choice. And I think it's never worked that way. I think what has changed, what is new, is the intensification of the affect and the ability to scale it up so significantly, which just wasn't possible under print, for example, or even pre-print, if you want to go back there. So there are just some initial responses to those.
Oh, yeah. I think in a way, Richard has managed to answer your question, because when politics emerged in modernity, it proposed itself as a separate sphere of reasoning, separate from religion, for instance. But of course, we know that things are never that clear. But there's a difference nowadays, I think, with social media, with electronic media, with television, with the whole image culture that now we live in. I think there's a kind of a turn, like even people in political science, they have been talking about this affective turn in politics right now. So the issue of, images and the issue of the imagination became more important, especially, I would say, in the last, 30 or 40 years. There's a book that I like very much by a French political scientist, in which he analyzes what he calls four political myths, contemporary political myths. And it's very peculiar how we can bring those myths to different national contexts. He talks about the myth of unity, the idea that the nation is a whole and there's a unity amongst these people. There's the myth of the savior, which applies very nicely to Bolsonaro and other Brazilian politics. And we know that the Portuguese and Brazilian culture were heavily influenced by, this whole idea of the religious savior. There's the myth of the golden age. And nowadays here in Brazil, the middle class loves to idealize the times of the military dictatorship. What we see in the protests nowadays here in Brazil, the protests for Bolsonaro, is a lot of people who believe that we would be better off if we just let the military, run the government, or at least open space for the president so that he wouldn't have to discuss politics with other political institutions like the superior courts. And finally, there's this conspiracy myth. And this guy, René Girard, the French political scientist, talks a lot about the idea of the global conspiracy and the whole imagination that, governments are plotting complots against the people. There's a very, very strong notion that universities, scientists, the media, and also the most traditional political institutions are joined in a global conspiracy in order to sell ideas, sell leftist ideas to the people. And this is actually the scariest part for me, I think, because this is something that we can find with people like Bannon. This is something that we can find in the US, in Europe right now, when we talk about the alt-right, for instance. This notion that it's important to take a stand against this global conspiracy that threatens the world in a very strange way, because it's, on the one hand, it's based on a lot of money on capital and people in positions of power. But on the other hand, the ideas behind this global conspiracy are basically leftist ideas. So those contradictions don't matter to those people because they're not thought in rational terms. They're thought in terms of myth and imagination. And that's the reason why I think nowadays there's a difference between the way that politics was contaminated before by emotions and affects and what's going on right now in the time of electronic media.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Richard. Now I'm gonna read some questions from the audience. So we're gonna start with a question by Guilherme Foscolo. And he's asking about how, because in relation to what you were talking about, the revolutionary role of the mask, and he's saying that it works, you said it works as a glue, but at the same time, he says also the Ku Klux Klan has remediated mask and anonymity. So it works, he says this glue works both ways in a way.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Guilherme. Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, in fact, I would argue that the right has been better at using masks and other kinds of objects, or, let's say, objects as mediation, other kinds of radical mediations than the left has been. I think that Ku Klux Klan is a great example of that, and obviously their hoods were both meant to conceal their identities and to create a sense of collectivity and multiplicity of force and uniformity of force. And yes, their remediation of the movie Birth of Nation is a great example. And I'll have to, when I turn this into something more formal, that's something I'll obviously want to deal with. But thinking about the more contemporary moment, and you can see this kind of right-wing sort of uniformity in many places, and a lot of it has to do with the difference of the politics between a kind of authoritarian right, which is happy to subordinate individual agency to the authority of the strong father figure, and the left, which is interested in diversity of opinion and so forth, so that we see so many of the battles in social media, for example, are, people who are more left than thou. You can make a political claim, but then somebody further left from you will criticize you, when in fact we should all be putting our energies, I think, to criticizing and overthrowing the right. So if you look at the recent American political elections, one of the ways Trump did this was with his Make America Great Again hats. So that red hat with the white Make America Great in the same font that everybody wore, either as caps or as t-shirts or anywhere else, helped to make what was actually a minority in the election, make it seem like it was larger than it was. And Trump is excellent at doing that. One of my critiques of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and one of the reasons I think he stalled, is that he didn't have something like that. There was nothing in the Sanders, all of the strong and large grassroots Sanders following that could identify them just at a quick glance and on the screen and so forth. And I thought that was a real problem. And what I would like to see happen actually as over the course of this summer, because I think it could be, it's hard to know, right? I mean, it could be that what's happening kinds of riots or uprisings, that people just get fed up so much at a certain point, they got to blow off steam. But then once it's done, it kind of, subsides and some gestures are made. In Minneapolis, for example, they raised the charges against the cop who killed from third-degree murder to second-degree, which is a more severe crime. And they also charged the other cops who were supporting him, which hadn't happened. So maybe things like that will quiet people down. But I actually suspect it's going to be a very long, hot summer in the US, because it's not only the being fed up about racial injustice of the cops and police violence, which we've seen over and over and over again since Ferguson, and one murder after another of Black men by cops shown on videos. It's not just that. It's because the pandemic has put so many people out of work and has impacted so unequally people of color and poor people and so forth, that I think that people have a lot of time. If you're not working, you've got time and anger and reason to be upset. So I think it's going to be a long summer. And I think one of the things that could make these movements and protests, whatever they might be, revolutions, rebellions, what could make them more powerful would be for people to wear black masks that say Black Lives Matter on them, or that just say BLM with a hashtag, one or the other. And if you imagine that first image I showed of all the diverse masks and all those people in the street, imagine all of them wearing the same black mask that said Black Lives Matter, and maybe also a black t-shirt that could also say the same thing, or just a black t-shirt. That's going to, I think, that's going to make people effectively, because this is affect we're talking about. This is going to affectively move people to want to be part of a collectivity in the way people wear caps of their favorite team, or in a hockey stadium in the US, jerseys, or in football in Europe and Latin America. Everybody's got the same jersey on. These kinds of things, and that's part of my argument, play a much more significant role, I think, than a lot of the political theorists imagine when they try to understand political unrest and what will motivate political unrest as simply something that is rational, self-interested, and so forth. So I would really love to see this happen. If I was an entrepreneur, I'm not, I would start marketing those masks, because I think, and in fact, it shouldn't be a white person who does. I think we should get some Black entrepreneurs to market those things, and we should all buy them, and they'll serve the double purpose, because not only could you wear them at a demonstration, but wearing them down the street, and you pass somebody in a Black Lives Matter mask when you're in the street or in the store, and you have a Black Lives Matter mask, and then you create this moment of connectivity, solidarity, and so forth. Also, you're going to get opposition. You're going to see people who are going to give you a hard time and may even be violent against you. So, there are costs, but I think the left has not been as good at using objects of any kind to mobilize. The left in the US, as I said, and I talk about this a little more in that blog post that I was referring to, in other countries and other protests, these kinds of objects, vests, just orange generally, masks, umbrellas, etc., these kinds of objects have been used to create and intensify a feeling of collectivity. So yeah, absolutely, they can work in both directions, and sadly, I think most often it's worked on the part of the right or the police or the military or so forth.
Thank you. I'm gonna also connect with something you referred to regarding sports, because there's also a question by Nicolaus Spaldoni, who's also asking about the relationship between sports and revolutionary mediation, because he's noting that in one of the pictures it actually looks like a scene from American football. That's the question from Nicolau. And for Eric, there's a question from Roberto, who's asking, what do you think is the most representative image right now? I think also in the same spirit of what is the image that sort of glues together this resistance against Bolsonaro, if there is one or not.
Should I answer now?
Yeah.
I don't think there is just one image, and Brazilians are known to be kind of specialists in the use of new media and the creation of memes. So there's a lot of really funny, memes about Bolsonaro, memes that represent the resistance some people are opposing to this government. Instead, I would say, for me, there's a very striking image in favor of Bolsonaro. Even before he was elected president, I remember seeing this image many times shared in social media. And this image reveals a very strong connection in Brazil, as in the US, but I think in Brazil is even clearer here in Brazil, the connection between politics and religion. Because it was a drawing of Bolsonaro, signing when he was beginning his term as a president. It was an image of Bolsonaro signing the documents, and Jesus Christ was right behind him, like guiding his hand through the signing of the document. And this was really, really strong, because there's a lot of people, especially the evangelical sector, which are very powerful right now in Congress. There's this huge representation of evangelicals in the Congress who believe that Bolsonaro is actually doing God's work in Brazilian politics. After 14 years of a leftist government, for some of these people, of course, it's not like all evangelicals. There's lots of progressive evangelicals who are opposing Bolsonaro, but for a lot of people, Bolsonaro is a hope for change, especially not so much in regards to what's going on in the economy, but rather in moral terms, in terms of defining what kinds of images we are going to create for the nation in the future, in terms of the education, in terms of how should we deal with young people and the universities. So I think the issue in Brazil, more than the economic reality that we're facing now, which has been pretty bad for the last, at least 6 or 10 years. It's much more an issue of connecting politics to religion and some moral values, which Bolsonaro, in the mind of these people, represents. So for me, this image is very, very powerful. But right now, what's going on in Brazil, which is interesting, I mentioned this before, is the fact that a lot of people are sharing the traditional symbols of anti-fascistic resistance, especially in Facebook and in Instagram. And when I mentioned before that the political situation is very tense, I didn't mean to say that it was balanced, because I would say that there's like 60 or 70% of the Brazilian population right now consider the Bolsonaro presidency bad or very bad, and around 30% of the people who are very strong supporters of Bolsonaro. I couldn't say which image is more representative of the resistance against Bolsonaro. There's many. There's like lots and lots of them on social media. But for me, the most representative image in favor of Bolsonaro is the one that connects Bolsonaro to the religious issue and to issues of moral. And we also know that Bolsonaro's campaign was constructed on the basis of, fake news and several lies against the previous government. And I'm not saying that the previous government didn't make lots and lots of mistakes, but I'm saying that Bolsonaro was attacking them in the wrong places. I mean, only because of their supposedly moral stances and values.
So, Eric, I wanted to two things. One, I don't want to give Nicolao's question short shrift, but I'll come back to that in a second. But what you were describing is the mirror image of Trump in the U.S. It's a minority of U.S. citizens who support Trump and who even voted for him. And the evangelical support is also very similar. I mean, evangelicals believe literally in the US that Trump was sent by God. And when people complain or rebut that by saying, why would God choose somebody who is, had multiple wives, who's, assaulted women, who's totally immoral, and so forth? What they say is, well, God has used imperfect men before to make, to get his way or to sort of bring his will to power and his will to the world. And so it's this weird thing where they don't even, there's nothing moral about Trump, as I believe there probably is nothing moral about Bolsonaro. But on Nicolao, I just want to quickly come back to your question.
Sorry, Richard, before you go back to Nicolao, Alex was also mentioning if you could comment on the last picture of Trump with the Bible, which is quite connected exactly with.
Exactly. And in fact, that's a good point. The Bible picture has been interesting because for a couple reasons. One, this actually has caused some evangelicals and some Republican senators who fancy themselves as Christians to break with Trump. First of all, he apparently was holding the Bible upside down. Second of all, he, brought in the military so he could safely walk to this church, did not let the minister of the church know that he was coming there in the first place. And people have been pretty angry, it seems, about Trump using Christianity, in a sense, to make a political point. So that really is connected. Also, there's been a meme that's going around, which is, I think, fake news, which shows a picture of Hitler in a similar stance, also holding a book or a Bible, and I believe that's been shown to have been photoshopped, and that happens all the time. Quickly, though, just on sports, to come back. Sporting figures have been political in many ways. So LeBron James and others wore "I Can't Breathe" T-shirts after the young man, I forget his name now, Eric Garner, I think, was killed in New York by cops and was saying as they were choking him, "I can't breathe," just as George Floyd was saying that. So LeBron James at that moment and other NBA players did make a statement by wearing "I can't breathe" t-shirts. And of course, Colin Kaepernick, the former quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, who has not been signed by any other team because of the fact that he insisted on kneeling during the national anthem, which was a sign of racial oppression to him. So there are sports figures who have played a political role, but that gets really complicated. And a lot of sports, depending on the sports, are players are more conservative. So, but yeah, clearly that picture does look like a scrum, almost a rugby scrum or a football line of scrimmage. And I do think that, as I said in the talk, that the cop uniforms and the protesters' uniforms do kind of let you see who the two teams are in a very clear way. So there are parallels in that respect.
Okay, so we have two more questions. There's one from Hernan Ulm to both of you, where he's asking if do you think that that democracy is a way of government that inscribes this idea of pandemia as a common ground shared by everybody in the same way, although it should be thought of its geographic and economic in geographical and economical differences. So if there's a relationship there, that's for both of you. And then just for Eric, there's a question from Cristobal Sea, and he's asking if this conspiracy issue is a mirror image of the myth of unity. So there's it works because it's like, oh, the left is united against you in those sense. So we have those two questions, and then we'll see if there's time for.
Eric, why don't you go first?
Thanks. Yeah. Regarding the first question, I would say that, yes, of course, there's a huge, when people here say, for instance, that the virus doesn't discriminate, that it strikes everyone equally, we know that's not true. Because the research shows that people who live in the slums, in the favelas, are suffering the effects of the virus in a much greater degree than the people, you know, who live in the city, the people who have money to go to private hospitals or to pay for health care. So this huge difference has been discussed in the media lately, but not enough. Because we always get the impression that the pandemic's not as real as the specialists say, because if you live in a nice neighborhood like, you know, Copacabana, Leblon, Ipanema, you have the impression that things are more or less normal. But when you go to the communities, then you have a real picture of the massacre that is going on. And, so many lives are being lost because there's no hospitals. They don't have health care. They can't pay for, medicine. So yes, this is a complete myth, in terms of the scientific idea that the myth is equal to everyone, that the effects of the myth, of the virus are equal for everyone. And regarding the second question about the connection between the idea of conspiracy and the myth of unity, yes, I think in a way this makes sense. Because the whole notion of conspiracy is that first you find something to blame. First you find something that is very easy to pinpoint and project all kinds of blames. So there must be someone working against us in an organized way in order to deprive us of our rights, in order to destroy the economy. And actually they believe that this organization is so great and so pervasive that all the institutions that we get information from are involved in it. So it's a very interesting and very effective idea, because if you no longer may believe in the press, if you no longer believe in science, if you no longer believe in academia, if you no longer believe in polls, then you have to resort to some messianic figure. Then you have to resort to your friends who are sharing information through WhatsApp groups. I know that WhatsApp is not as popular in the US as it is in Brazil, but here it was a very important tool for Bolsonaro's campaign. Actually, a lot of people say that Bolsonaro won due to the work that they did in terms of placing bots in Twitter, creating groups, WhatsApp groups to share news about moral issues, about this huge conspiracy of the left against the good Christians of Brazil. So yeah, there's this connection that believes that these institutions are organized to work as a unity against Christianity, for instance. And that's why they believe the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing here. People might say that Bolsonaro is coarse, that Bolsonaro is, aggressive, but on the other hand, he's doing God's work because he's the only force that is opposing this huge wave of leftist immoralism, the danger of communism. People have been talking in Brazil like all the time about the dangers of communism. And we lived under 14 years of a leftist regime, and communism was not close to what we experience here in Brazil. So that's when we realize the power of those imaginary constructions. You sell myths, you sell symbols to the people, and they're going to believe that because sometimes they don't even have access to traditional sources of information.
So to pick up on the question about conspiracy and unity, the same thing happens in terms of racism as well, especially in the US, but elsewhere. That is to say, that Black people are in this imaginary created as some sort of unified threat to white people. And so Frantz Fanon is very good, obviously, on this in Black Skin, White Masks and elsewhere, the way in which these imaginary projections of Blacks and Blackness as terrifying creates fear among people. So it's a system in which you ascribe somebody as a threat, and then you see them. A white person ascribes Black person as a threat. You see this Black skin, and you feel threatened. And the Black subject has no agency whatsoever in that, but is simply there as this kind of relay or this mirror, to use the term that Cristobal used. And then to come back to Hernan's question, which is a really good one, I think you were asking about, maybe ironically, about how democracy as a system does hold on to a kind of notion of equality that would lend itself to this idea that everybody is affected the same way. But it's not democracy, I think, alone, or democracy in all of its manifestations, but it certainly is neoliberal democracy. And neoliberal democracy, where everything gets reduced to economic calculation, presumes that money is the kind of equal measure, and that if other people, everybody's affected equally, some people happen to have worked harder and earned on their own, more money or something like that. But it's both, I would say. It is democracy, but as a way of government, but it's especially neoliberal democracy, in which the common sense is that that race doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter, sexuality doesn't matter, ethnicity doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is your individual ability to succeed or to earn money for yourself or to accomplish things. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Eric. We are out of time now. I think it's been a very, very interesting discussion. I think it's a very hot topic right now, so it's obviously we would need more time to keep discussing that, but I think it's a very, very good starting point for that. So I would like to thank you both for taking the time to participate in this event. Also, well, now I'm going to switch to Spanish. Gracias a todos por participar. Gracias nuevamente a los organizadores de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y del Instituto de Investigaciones de Cultura y Arte de la Universidad de Salta. Y quisiera simplemente para cerrar, bueno, volver a agradecer a Richard y a Eric por su presencia y dejarlos invitados a todos y a todas para el próximo miércoles continuar con la el tercer encuentro de este ciclo, que será el próximo miércoles y donde nos presentarán Fernando Pérez de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y Sergio Martínez Luna de la Universidad Nacional de Educación a distancia la próxima semana. Así que, bueno, sin nada más que agregar, vuelvo a agradecer a todos, a los presentadores y a quienes nos acompañaron. Muchas gracias y buenas noches.
Chao, Claudio. Bye, Richard.